Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Suit Up. Man, it has been a while since I've done one of these. It's time for the conclusion of Banshee Week, with this episode dedicated to her base abilities in depth and taking a look at the builds I'm using for her. She can be picked up in the Tenno Lab in the dojo after doing the research, but how does she stack up against other frames? Well, her 300 health and shield at rank 30 are pretty much average, not particularly outstanding. Her 225 power capacity, pretty average, and her armour of just 15 is joint lowest of any Warframe in the game, alongside a few other frames, which makes her extremely squishy. Her sprint speed of 1.1 is pretty decent and slightly above average as well. So, if her base stats aren't particularly impressive, it's her powers where her true strength lies, and that is absolutely true. Her first ability, Sonic Boom. Very simple ability. She sends out a wave of sound in a 180-degree cone in front of her. All enemies caught in this cone will be ragdolled backwards, dealing 50 impact damage. The wave itself has a range of 15 meters. As you can imagine, range is affected by power range mods, damage by power strength. Now, there's a couple of things to remember about this ability. Some animation states seem to mean that enemies completely ignore the ragdoll from the ability, plus not only does it have a line of sight to the ability, it also has a little bit of travel time, meaning that enemies at the edge of the range will be knocked down slightly after the activation of the ability, although that time is really short. It is a fantastic little ability. It's cheap, it's spammable, and when modded correctly, it can do a really decent... It's got a really decent range to it. While the damage is pathetic, really should never be modded for. A high range build really can knock a wide area down and keep the knockdown almost constantly. Simple, but very effective. Plus, when modded with the augment I looked at on Monday, it can be a huge asset against armoured enemies. So from one simple ability to one, I guess, not quite so simple. Her second ability, and arguably her strongest, which is Sonar. She will let out a sound wave, revealing each and every enemy in range on the minimap. Any enemy affected by this ability will be marked with a weak spot that when hit will amplify any damage done by 500% at base, and that's going to last for 30 seconds. The range of the ability can be increased with range mods, strength of the damage multiplier with power strength, and the duration obviously with duration mods. This is one of the strongest team-based abilities in the game by far. The ability to multiply people's damage, or by potentially nearly 1500% on weapons or even skills. Things like M Prime's explosion will hit the sonar targets when you are maxed out on power strength. That is insane. And then the ability to either recast it or using the resonance augment that really rewards both you and your teammates' accuracy, that can really take lower level weapons way further than they should. You can help lower ranked players out with weapons that might not be so strong or particularly well modded, or players in sorties with weapons that probably shouldn't be there. Remember though, that if you recast Sonar before the original wave hits its maximum range, it cancels the original wave at the point that you recast, and it never reaches that max range. So if you spam Sonar multiple times at once, you're not actually getting any benefit from doing that whatsoever. Again, another incredible team support ability that can really turn the tide when things are getting tough, and possibly one of the strongest abilities in the game for sure. However, her third ability to look at is Silence. This time Banshee's activating a kind of aura around her, sort of, that's what I'm going to call it, but that lasts for 25 seconds and has a 20 meter span. Any enemy that gets touched by this aura will first be staggered, opening them up to finishers for a short time, and then will be deafened. Deaf enemies will not be able to hear things like gunshots from your teammates or death screens from their comrades. However, they can still see. Although combine this with radial blind, and not only can they not hear, they now can't see either, which is fun for them, I guess. Enemies that are hit with silence will be they won't be alerted by it, and will remain unalerted even after the stagger ends, although they will be alerted if they physically see you. The stun from the silence cannot be reapplied by enemies by running out of range and back in again, although they will be reaffected by the stagger if you recast the ability when it ends. This can be great crowd control, since any enemy that comes into the range of the ability will be staggered for that few seconds and also be opened up for finishers. So combining this with something like a radial disarm Loki, you can bring them all in close to you, but also control the range that they stop at. And obviously things like the infested, I mean, it goes without saying that they're going to try and get close to you. But because it's an aura around Banshee, you can move with it, providing that mobile crowd control, and with the augment, also give enemies increased finisher damage on them, increasing abilities that rely on finisher damage like Blade Storm or Tentacle Swarm, or even other melee weapons. A well-modded silence can be another fantastic team buff. And so, onto her fourth and final ability. This is Soundquake. Banshee channels all of her abilities, all of her energy, into a radiating sound wave, doing 200 blast damage per second over 20 meters, as well as staggering all enemies within the range of the ability. There is an initial burst of 200 blast damage as soon as the ability is cast, before the damage per second kicks in. And since it's a toggleable ability, there is a drain attached to it of 12 energy per second. Now there's a bunch of mods that affect this. Damage is increased power strength, range by range mods. Drain is also by duration and efficiency mods. Like all toggleable abilities, Soundquake will disable not only energy siphon, but also Xenuric's energy regen as well, so Carrier is the only thing that will pick up energy while you're in the ability. Despite it being affected by a whole bunch of mods, it's not a particularly complex ability at all. As I said earlier, every enemy touched by Soundquake, except for the stuff like nullifiers, are staggered constantly, meaning they can't even move at all, effectively taking them out of the fight completely. And while blast damage might not be the greatest, it's enough to get the job done, especially with the resonating Quake augment. Not only does the Soundquake provide fantastic crowd control to the team, the damage isn't half bad either, so it can be a huge help in a sticky situation. It's important to remember though, that you are not invincible while in that ability, so you can still be shot by enemies that are out of range of the ability. Make sure you are always paying attention to what is going on around you. But finally, on her abilities is her passive ability, which is that all weapons are silent when Banshee uses them. Now, I know that people have had many different opinions on this passive, saying that it makes silence pointless. Yes and no though, in my opinion. While I can understand that it can look like this, remember that enemies outside of silence could hear Banshee's weapons beforehand and would be alerted to Banshee, which kind of negates the whole keeping enemies unalerted thing. So personally, I think it fits Banshee's kit very well, and it doesn't make silence useless. In fact, it enhances it. It's effectively extended the range of silence's silent parts in the entire map. So instead of looking at it that it's taken away from silence, look at actually what it's added to that ability. The ability to keep them constantly unalerted is something that is very, very much underutilized and not really talked about when people are talking about their their ideas and their thoughts on the passive. Now I've got 4 main builds that I use for Banshee. Each of them have their own purpose though. The first one you'll see here is Resonating Quake build that you saw in the video yesterday. Obviously we've got the augment on there, we've got a bunch of power strength, both transient and intensify. We've got fleeting on there for efficiency, prime flow for energy storage, vitality for a bit of survivability, and cunning drift for extra range combined with overextended. Now this build is focused on pushing the range of the augment rather than straight damage, using the crowd control as its main focus, plus the stacking effect to build the damage up over time. There is room for a bit of personal preference with this one though, which is to change, for example, overextended out for stretch. You will lose a fair amount of range on the ability, but you gain way more damage. It kind of depends on what you want it for, damage or crowd control. So I would swap those mods around depending on what you're doing at the time. Vitality could also be switched out for quick thinking. However, I don't like relying solely on that. There's too much room for the quick thinking stagger to effectively kill you. But it is an option if you want to go that way. Second build that you can see now, it's focused around self-buff silence, however not savage silence. I go for intensify and transient for power strength, but also combining transient with a max fleeting for as little duration as possible. This effectively means that silence lasts 2 seconds and can be used as an almost constant stun, helping really limit the amount of enemy fire that's actually coming in at you, which is why I want a larger range by adding cunning drift and stretch to make sure that there are as many enemies as possible stunned by silence. It stops them shooting back at you. Then we have a couple of quality of life mods. Handspring, so that if you get knocked down you can get up again quickly, and natural talent to cut down the animation time. The reason I have no savage silence though, that's because this is a solo focus build ready for a dagger with covert lethality, to just one-shot everything in from level 1 to 1,000,000, so However, if you want to have Savage Silence on there so you're not tied down to a dagger for your melee, I switch out Overextended for stretch, slightly less range, more bonus damage, and Cunning Drift for Savage Silence augment. This means you can have your silence build and not worry about using daggers if you don't want to. Third one is a Resonance build. That focuses mostly on power strength. You've got Transient Fortitude on there, Intensify, Power Drift, all buffing strength. Then of course you've got Resonance mod, Stretch for a bit of range, Prime Flow for power storage, Prime Continuity for duration, and Streamline for a bit of efficiency. It's a pretty well-rounded build, balanced over the stats, which is great for getting a lot out of Resonance and Sonar. Too many people go overboard, I think, with the power strength, but for the content we have in the game right now, this amount of power strength will easily be more than enough. And the final build, I guess, isn't really much of a separate build, but it's an addition to this one. This is I swap out Intensify. You can add in another augment of your choice. Any of the augments are pretty effective with this build. And when I talk about the team buff Savage Silence, this is the build I actually use for it. You know, switch out Intensify, put Savage Silence in there. But what do I actually think of Banshee? Do I think she's worth maxing out? Those of you that have been watching the videos this week should have already guessed this, but quite frankly, she is one of the strongest support frames in the game when played right. But right now, she is hugely underused. She has an incredible amount of stuff she can bring to a team. From the crowd control from 3 of her 4 abilities, increasing damage from weapons, while rewarding accuracy, or the utility that stripping armor can bring, or buffing certain abilities. She can do it all. Now, I'm not gonna lie, she is a difficult frame to play right. She doesn't have a lot of health, and she doesn't have any abilities that directly buff her survivability, so she can be very squishy and tough to play. But master that, and you will have a valuable asset to any team. Make sure your sonar is up constantly, along with your silence. Silence is effectively your only survivability. I don't run around at all without that thing enabled at all times. But remember, stick close to your teammates. Banshee really cannot take a hit, especially at higher levels where the sorties begin. Things like nullifiers regularly one-shot her. Additionally, experiment with whether you like the vitality or quick thinking. I can see the attraction of using it for sorties to try and stop yourself being one-shot constantly. I don't particularly like relying on my energy for health quite that much personally, especially not on a very heavy caster like Banshee. But it's something I'm going to be playing around with a little bit more. Especially, I've been hit with the quick thinking stagger so many times and died that it just gets frustrating. But again, like I say, it's going to be something I'm going to be testing a bit more in the future. But movement is your friend. Never stop moving. Enemy accuracy is supposed to be reduced when they are shooting at moving target. Although, to be fair, the amount of times a nullifier has shot me out of the air today in today's sorties would have me thinking otherwise, but just never stop moving because it is supposed to work that way. In terms of arcanes though, it's one of those that is going to be personal preference. However, the one and only augment I have on my Banshee right now is Arcane Energize for the extra energy on pickup from that procs. Helps me keep my abilities up way more often than it would have done before, and can be a huge boost to the output of skills from Banshee. However, Banshee, she's potentially the next frame to get primed. She is insanely squishy, but makes up for it by being one of the strongest crowd control frames in the game. Played well, she can be the linchpin of any team. I would absolutely recommend you give her a go. Try her out again and see how much of a bonus you can be to your team. I hope you all enjoyed this very in-depth look at Banshee over this week. Please give me some feedback in the comments below as to whether you like this, I guess the layout of this week, looking at the augments and then the frame at the end of the week, plus any ideas for any future content. I'm making content for you guys to enjoy. So just provide some feedback in the comments below. I read all the comments. So as always, many thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing those comments in the comments below, and I shall see you in the next episode.